I love his feeding tube. I hate his feeding tube. I love his feeding tube because it kept my son alive. Hi, you're listening to episode 13 of The Rare Life. I'm your host, Madeline Cheney, and I have a solo episode for you today. I have chosen to give an entire episode about Kimball's feeding journey. This is actually a topic I don't love thinking about or talking about because it has been something I don't try to remember. I have a lot of hard, traumatic memories from trying to feed Kimball. He is a tubie-graduate, and he now is able to eat by mouth, which we're really excited about at 2 years old. He still has his G-tube button as needed. That's for surgeries. It's also been really helpful when Kimball is sick. So let's talk feeding tubes, both for people who can relate and have children who have been tube fed or still are tube fed, and for those who wonder what it's like to have a child with a feeding tube. So Kimball needed a feeding tube straight off right after he was born. He never has breastfed, and it took him a long time before he would take a bottle because of his nose. And I've talked about this in previous episodes, but really quick, just as a review, because he does no nose bone, his nasal airway is really restricted. He has hardly any openings in his nares, which is a fancy word for nostrils. And so before he was born, we kind of knew that that was a possibility for him to have feeding issues. And so because babies need to breathe through their nose while they're taking a bottle or nursing. And so that is kind of his main reason for needing a tube. Later, that's what they always blamed it on. But later, I kind of suspected also that his low muscle tone had a lot to do with his inability to take a bottle, because I think he just tired out really fast. And as he got bigger and a little bit stronger and older, he was able to take a bottle really well. But I still noticed his nose didn't seem any more open. He still had a lot of issues with his nose. And so I was like, I think that may be more of his muscle tone. So anyway, that's kind of my suspect, but I guess we don't really know. But I think it's a combination of his airway and his low muscle tone. So when he was born, he was given an OG tube. And I looked up what that stands for, and I'm not even going to read it because it's gibberish, it's medical stuff, but it's just a feeding tube that typically they go in through the nose. It's called an NG tube. But for Kimball, he was given an OG tube going through his mouth. So it just be threaded in through the side of his mouth and then down his throat, right into his stomach. And so that is a pretty rare thing for kids to have. I think because it's less pleasant since it goes right in through your mouth and it's harder to keep in. But he didn't have an NG tube because of his really narrow airway to begin with. And so he had an OG tube in the NICU. And so I pumped for him. I pumped breast milk for him to have. And I thought it was so interesting because when he was born, and being in the NICU anyway, they need you to pump milk or they can be given formula or donated milk because you're not always there. And I actually had been planning on exclusively pumping for Kimball anyway before we even knew anything was wrong with him, because with Wendy, I had a heck of a time trying to breastfeed her, and I think she was tongue-tied. We found out later, but it was a nightmare. And long story short, I had to exclusively pump for her. I didn't have to. I could have given her formula, but I wanted to, and so we did that. And exclusively pumping, meaning just using a breast pump and giving her the milk in a bottle. So basically living on the couch pumping all day and all night. It's a labor of love, but I thought it was easier and I liked it more than breastfeeding because that was such a nightmare. So, fed is best. Anyway, that was really cool because of that, I felt a little traumatized from like the experience with Wendy, like trying to breastfeed her. And so in order to feel brave enough to have another child, I had to say, okay, I can do this if I just plan on not breastfeeding and just pumping. Like that's how terrible my experience was. So with Kimball, I had already planned on exclusively pumping. So I thought that was kind of a silver lining, that I had already had the experience of exclusively pumping, that made it easier for when Kimball was in the NICU. And so I felt kind of like a pro. And I really do feel like that was so awesome. That's such a blessing that I already had that experience, because everything else was so new and so scary and so unknown. And that was something I could do with confidence because I already knew how to do that. And I really feel for other moms that are trying to adjust to everything in the NICU and figure out exclusively pumping, because that in and of itself is an art and a skill. And a lot of people hate it. So, I understand when parents don't go that route. But anyway, so I pumped for Kimball, and it was kind of it felt really meaningful to me to be able to do that for him, because I felt like I had a lot of my role as a mother kind of stripped away because he was in the NICU. And so, I wasn't taking care of him. Like I visited him. That's kind of your, and helped make decisions. But that kind of is where your role as a parent, hangs out with the child in the hospital, because, nurses and doctors are taking care of your child. And so I was really happy, and it was kind of this like therapeutic thing I had to pump for him, because I felt like that was something I could do for him and something I knew that would be really helpful for him. And especially like with his medical complexities and stuff, I wanted to give him an extra little shot at life and to be just a little bit healthier with that. And so that was like a meaningful thing for me to be able to do. It was still a huge sacrifice and a ton of work, and I kind of hated it, but it was also really therapeutic to be able to do that. And I went a little crazy with it. So because I knew what it was like to pump for a year with Wendy, and she was my first, so I didn't have any other children to take care of. And I was like, I don't think I can do that for a year. But I wanted Kimball to have that for a year, the breast milk. And so I decided that when my milk was coming in, I just pumped everything. And the lactation consultant was like, I don't recommend doing that because you might end up with like way more milk than you want. Because when you take it out, it makes more. And so you're telling your body to keep making more every time you empty completely. And I was like, bring it on. I want all the milk I can possibly get so I can build up a stash, because I'd heard of moms doing that. And so I was pumping 42 ounces in a 24-hour period. So moms out there who have measured milk in some way, like that's a lot. The average that a baby will eat in a 24-hour period is 20 to 24 ounces. And that's like once they've like gotten a lot bigger than Kimball was. And he was even off feeds for half the time because of his stomach and stuff. And so that's a lot of milk. I would have like these huge pitcher in the fridge of all my milk, and I would just store it in there. And then every 24 hours we would pour it into the freezer bags and stick that in the freezer and bring some to the hospital for Kimball, and the rest we would stick in the freezer. And we bought 2 chest freezers, like a really big one and then a smaller one, just for my breast milk, because there was so much. In fact, I will post pictures of the chest freezers in the show notes, because I feel like it's impressive. I like looking at that. I'm like, I'm a cow, like so much milk. So I was able to do it. I did it at 6 months old. I'll go back to the NICU. We'll go back to that story. But at 6 months old, when he was 6 months old, I was able to stop pumping, which was such a relief because it was such a pain and it was really stressful. But I stopped when he was 6 months, and we like used the stash for the rest of his first year. So when he turned 1, I had just run out. And so that was something I was really proud of. I felt really like accomplished with that. And I loved telling people that and seeing the shock. And I also remember that at the NICU, they had a mother's pumping room. And I hope they have this at every hospital. I don't know if they do, but at the hospital Kimball was in, right across from the NICU, they had a nice room where women could go in there, and they had these really nice electric breast pumps in there and magazines. And they had a no talking policy, like no electronics and stuff, so that it was just quiet. And it was kind of an escape for me, even though it was a sacrifice I was making for Kimball and had to go in there every 2 to 3 hours to go pump. It was really nice to have like this set time that I had to go off of myself and just breathe and have a break from the NICU and kind of process, what we had found out that day and the different news we would get. And so I actually really, I don't know, I'm kind of fond of that memory of going in there and pumping and then being super proud because I had like all this milk to give him. And I think I know what it's like to also like to pump and then to not have as much as you want for your baby. And I'm really grateful that that's not what I was struggling with Kimball, although I did with Wendy, because again, I think that would have added more stress to a really stressful situation. So with that, with the breast milk, we were able to feed it to him through his OG tube. And we also worked with some feeding therapists there to try to help him take milk by bottle because we didn't know yet if he would be able to take at least some. And he didn't do too well, and that was pretty discouraging. He would take, probably 10 mils, and that would be this huge accomplishment, but it was a very small portion of how much he needed to eat. And we would take these, I don't know, they're like Q-tips. I'm trying to think of what they would be called, but they have like a little tiny sponge on the tip. And I'll put this in the show notes too. We have this really cute video of Kimball. We would take it and dip it in my milk, and then we could like kind of like stick it in his mouth or let him lick it. And it was so cute. It was so cute because he really liked being able to taste milk. And it's kind of heartbreaking to watch that video, but really sweet at the same time because my heart aches because he wasn't able to just drink milk like most babies can. And so but it was really sweet that he was still able to have that experience that most babies have. He was able to taste milk and he really liked it, and that was really fun for us. That was a fun thing for Justin and I to do in the NICU when a lot of the things we were doing there were stressful and decision making and the getting of bad news. And so that's kind of one of those highlights for me from our experience in the NICU. So Kimball was in the NICU for only 22 days. It was kind of a sudden discharge, at least it felt sudden, like kind of out of nowhere. They were like, do you guys he's doing pretty well. Do you want to just take him home? He can come home tomorrow if you want. And we were like, what? We were so excited and so nervous to learn everything. But of course we wanted him home as soon as possible. And so I feel like we really rushed through the training. So they trained us about how to do different things for his care, like his collar and stuff. And they taught us how to put in his feeding tube and how to use the feeding pump. And for those who have not had a child or known someone with a feeding tube, it's very medical and it's very technical. And there are syringes and there's lubricant for the tube to go down, and there's taping and measuring and clamping off. And it's a very to give you an idea, when I would a few times I had my mom or mother-in-law take care of Kimball when we would go somewhere, and they would feed him. The notes for them was 2 pages typed up of first push this button and then do this and then rinse out this thing and then clamp that and then pull back for this. Like just the steps. It's just, you know, you get fast at it, but like there are a lot of technical steps. And so it was really overwhelming when they were teaching us this stuff, but we were excited and we just wanted to get him home. And so we left before we were ready, which I didn't realize till we got home. And it was time for us to be on our own and to feed Kimball. And so Kimball's feeding, like his feeding tube and just trying to keep him fed, that was one of the most painful and challenging things that we've had with him. And that's saying something. It was really, really hard. And this is especially the time of life I don't love remembering and thinking about. It was very, very hard. And part of my takeaway from this episode is that we survived it despite everything. And I know that people go through harder things, but like for us, like the fact that we survived this time in our life was like looking back, I'm like, oh my goodness, how did we do that? And I feel really, really strong. Kind of as a preface for this, I remember I was driving home from the hospital one day, and this was like, Kimball was quite a bit older, and we're driving home, and I was listening to the radio, and they were talking about these people who were in prison. I don't remember like the exact context, but basically they were on a food strike. And so they were refusing to eat, but the people at the jail were like, well, we can't let them die. And so we're just going to tube feed them. And so they shoved tubes down their nose, like to give them an NG feeding tube, like these full grown adults. And then they force fed them that way. And people had to hold them down and, you know, stick these in and stuff. And the commentary on that was like whether or not that was ethical. And they were talking about how this was a form of torture because they said the process is so painful and so uncomfortable and it was against their will. And they said that was like torture to do that to them when they didn't want it. And that really hit me hard. That was really hard to hear. And I know they weren't meaning it. Like this was not something that was aimed at parents who have had to do that for their child. But I'll never forget that they called that torture. And I was thinking about Kimball and all these, you know, sweet little kids that we have to do that for to keep them alive. And I kind of felt like a monster, which I know is totally twisted because I'm his mom and I was doing it because I love him. But it kind of gave another validation to watching him suffer when we would try to feed him. And so going back to when we got home, we would have to, like, his tubes would come out all the time. So in a perfect world, the tube will stay taped to their face. And so, you know, whether it's going in their nose or their mouth, so you don't have to keep putting it in because that's like, I haven't had one, but they say that's they don't say, I just see that that's the worst part is when you're trying to shove this tube down their throat. And so in a perfect world, it stays put and you don't have to keep putting it back in. But in our experience, it would come out once or twice a day. And so there we were trying to struggle to shove this tube down Kimball's throat. Now this tube, it literally just goes in his mouth, down his throat, and into his stomach. And when they were training us, they said, once he starts choking, you know that you've gone in the right spot and just keep pushing it down once they start gagging and choking. Okay, so that's our cue. Cool, we're doing this right because our child is gagging and choking. And then they say to take the syringe and you hook it up to the tube and what you call pull back. So you pull back the plunger thing and you're supposed to see if you get stomach fluid. And then, I hope no one's eating right now. And then once you get stomach fluid, you know that you've put the tube in their stomach and not their lungs. Because if you put it in their lungs, on accident, which you totally can, then you will fill their lungs with fluid, which, as you can imagine, is really bad. And so we would do that. We'd pull back. And by the way, when I told my mom that, when I was telling her about that like possibility, she like turned all white and looked like she was going to pass out, like, oh, it's so much pressure. And it's so much pressure. And the big glitcher for Kimball is, for some reason, he like very rarely would be able to get any stomach fluid back on him. But like, you know, nothing happened, luckily. But that was really stressful to be like, I'm not getting any fluid back, but I'm pretty dang sure this is his stomach. And then we would just go for it. And luckily he lived and all was well. That was all in the haze of the new, you know, the first few months. And so, yeah, like needless to say, Kimball would be screaming and writhing and super upset and fighting us. And one of us would have to hold him down and hold his hands down and hold his head straight. And while the other one tried to get the tube down. And it's kind of like watching your child get a shot, but like way worse and like all the time. You know, where you feel like you're a traitor because they're suffering and they're looking at you like, how are you letting this happen to me? But like that happened all the time. And so we would try to shove it down, and sometimes it would curl in his mouth and not go down his throat. It would just kind of come out his mouth the other end, and we'd like try to shove it in again, because when he'd be screaming, it'd kind of restrict his throat. And we'd just be sweating and like so stressed trying to get this down as fast as possible so we could feed him. We'd tape it to his face. And it was really awful. That would happen in the middle of the night. Sometimes it would slip out. It would, anytime it could slip out. And so it's just so medical. Just all of it is so medical. Like you have to like work the machine and the pump and, you know, what buttons to push and prime the pump and rinse out the pump afterwards. And there were syringes all over the house and bits of tape and lubricant for the tubes and just our life had just become so medical from just the feeding tube alone. Kimball would take some milk by mouth. We would give him a bottle while the feed was going, while he was being fed. And so that was trying to build up like his stamina and help him learn to eventually just take a bottle. And so when we were hopeful that he could just get off the tube and just have it for a couple weeks and then like just be able to take all of it by mouth instead through a bottle. That didn't happen. But anyway, so we would feed him by mouth with a bottle during his feeds. And when the tube would come out and we'd be struggling to put it back in, or I would just really, really not want to. Like it was a very unpleasant experience to do that. And so I would put it off and I'd be like, well, maybe he can just take enough milk and not need it. And so we'd feed him and like just really push him, which I think also caused issues later with feeding because you're not supposed to force them. But I was so desperate and I would just keep pushing him, trying to get him to eat more. And he wouldn't. And then he would kind of fall asleep, which is a stress response. And he was tired. And so I'd be like, oh, maybe he'll be fine. Like he had like, you know, half his feed that he's supposed to have, but you know, he fell asleep, so he must be okay. And I'd put him to bed. So that would happen. That happened for a few days. We were just really resisting putting the tube in because we hated it so much. And we were just trying to get by with just giving him what he would take by mouth. But then we found that he was losing a lot of weight from that. And so, you know, that was great. I was like, well, I feel super guilty now, like, like starving our baby. And then this one time in particular, we just couldn't get the tube in. And we were going to a feeding therapist then. And I told him, I was like, we just have had really bad luck. Like, we just can't get the tube to go down. And I think maybe Kimball was just getting really good at like, I don't even know. I don't know why it wasn't going down. It just wasn't. And so we kept trying and it just wouldn't work. So we're at the feeding therapist and I was like, yeah, like we can't get it down. Can you help me like put it back in? And they were like, wait, it's an OG tube? And I was like, yeah. And they're like, oh, we know how to do NG, but we don't know how to do an OG. And I was like, oh, so what should I do? And they were like, well, you can find out if your pediatrician can. And so I think they called the pediatrician right there and asked them if they know how. And they're like, no, we don't know how to do an OG, like the pediatrician's office. And we're like, that's weird. And they're like, well, you could go to the emergency department because like they're good at inserting tubes. And so they might know. So maybe just go to the emergency department at the hospital and see if they can do it. And we're like, are you kidding me? Like, no one knows how to do this. And that was really scary because like all these people that we, would go to for like to know this stuff, like they didn't even know how to do it because of OGs being so rare. And so I was like, I'm not dragging my butt and my baby to the hospital because we'd already had enough of the hospital. We were going there for appointments and I was like, no, it was a 30-minute drive. So I can't complain. That's not too bad, but I really didn't want to do that. And so, luckily our home health nurse who would just come in and help us at different points, we called her and she came and she was able to successfully get the tube down. And then after she did, she was like, that was my first time doing an OG tube. Like they'd been trained on it, but she had never had to do it. So, that was a fun adventure. And we even tried with her. We were like, let's just try an NG. Because it just didn't, for some reason, it doesn't seem as awful for some reason. I don't know why. It's probably just as bad. But so we tried that and that came out quickly because he couldn't breathe and he started struggling. And so we pulled that out. So that confirmed our suspicion that would not work. So there are some really convenient things about a feeding tube that I also feel like I need to like take a nod to. So it is so convenient to be able to take your baby after they wake up and, they're super hungry, like when they're newborns and all they do is sleep and then eat and then go back to bed. So Kimball would wake up and we just have a feed ready in the feeding tube. And I had like the backpack all ready to go. And we would just get him out of bed and pop him in the car and head to the library or go on a walk. Because I remember like with Wendy, like, you feed them and then they're ready to go back to bed or like shortly thereafter. And I was like, we're not gonna be able to go anywhere. And so we were able to like just feed him through his feeding tube wherever we were. And even while we were driving. So that was really convenient. And like he had a lot of appointments in the first few months at the hospital, which was 30 minutes away. And so we would, a lot of times, either on our way to the appointment or on our way home, I would just have the feeding tube running and he would be fed while I was driving. Like, I really love efficiency and I love like hacks like that. That was so cool. Like we'd come out of an appointment and I'd be like, oh, he needs to be fed. That's okay. I'll hook him up and he'll eat while we're driving. And there's like that delay of like where he doesn't know he's being fed because he's not, getting the bottle or the breast right in his mouth. But after a few minutes of fussing, then he'd realize like, oh, I'm getting more full and he'd have a pacifier and stuff. So that would help. But that was like really nice. And then like while we would be on walks, we'd have the feeding pump going and I just have it hanging on the stroller and he'd be eating and we'd be able to, go on our merry way. And so like, that was really nice. He also was able to eat while he was sleeping. So he would like be sleeping. He slept a lot. He slept extra because I think it's because of his low muscle tone. So I think he just tired out easier. But, after like 2 or 3 hours, I'd be like, oh, he should be eating. And especially because of his weight gain concerns. And so I didn't do this all the time, but sometimes I would get the feeding pump already. And then I would sneak in his room, hook up, especially if the tube was able to stay in. Because, sometimes it'd come out. But if it were still in him, then I could just sneak in there and screw the end of the feeding pump to his feeding tube that was coming out of his mouth and then hit run and sneak out. And he would be fed while he was sleeping and he would sometimes just take a longer nap because he was fed. And that was kind of a desperation too, just to have a little more time with just Wendy or trying to pump or whatever it was. But that was really nice. I don't know if you're really supposed to do that. In fact, I think the feeding therapist told me not to do that. And so I had to stop. because then he does not getting like the natural process of like, oh, he was supposed to be like drinking his bottle while he was getting full from his feeding tube. So he would learn that I need to suck in order to get nutrients. So, but I did that, and that was really cool. It was also like with the feeding pump and being out and about, I also got a lot of stares and a lot of like, I mean, we like stuck out. Like there's this tube coming from my baby and he's eating. And I think most people have seen feeding tubes or maybe even know what they are, but I definitely stuck out. And my personality is such that I didn't mind sticking out. Like I kind of like the idea of like bucking off, like, you know, the stereotypes or whatever. But so that's good. I think it'd be hard if I hated, you know, when people like having attention. But I remember in particular, we went to this work party for Justin's work, and we were there, and I remember thinking like, man, Kimball's I just feel so different than everyone else here, because I had like the feeding tube or the feeding pump in my little backpack carrier thing, and I had that on my back, and he was sleeping, and I had like the tube hooked up to him, and like people just, I mean, they notice, you know, they notice it looks different, and so I felt very like kind of just different. But I also am very proud of the badge of special needs mom. Like I feel like the people I share that title with are generally just awesome people. So I mean, I really was proud to, you know, look different and have this medical thing and have the feeding pump and stuff and stand out. But it also feels a little isolating because people just don't understand and they don't, you know, get it unless you seek them out. But I felt very BA, not gonna lie. So at 3 months old, Kimball got his G tube, and that is when they surgically make an opening in his stomach. So basically you have an opening that you can connect the tube to that will just shoot whatever they're eating into their stomachs directly. And that was a very natural decision for us. It wasn't hard to make because I knew it would make our lives and Kimball's life better. We wouldn't have to mess with sticking tubes down his throat anymore. That was really interesting because I knew it would make everything easier, but I was not, they kept telling us how minor of a surgery that is. But I was unpleasantly surprised at how the recovery. So I think it was at least 2 weeks of him being really sore. And I mean, I assume he was sore because he was crying all the time. And you know, you have to like clean the stoma, which is the fancy word for like the surgical site, like where they cut it open. And there's something also that's just kind of jarring or unpleasant about seeing this hole in your child that you opted in for. Like just seeing that, it was kind of like, oh, my baby has a hole in him, like that I told them they could cut. That was hard for a little bit, and then I was like, it's good for him and it's good for us, like this will help. Anyway, that's worth a nod to that. And having a G-tube was just really, 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 really awesome. Like once he recovered, and so we just bypassed his throat and all that, and we just could stick it right into his stomach, and we quickly learned how to do that, and that was so great. So at 9 months old, I'll never forget this, I swear. In his Kimball-like way, we were just sitting in church with my mom. We were like visiting her, and I had the feeding backpack with us with like the pump and everything. And I also had the bottle where we would try to feed him some with that, and then the feeding pump. And I was like, I'll just give him his bottle first and then I'll hook him up. So I gave him his bottle, and he drank the whole stinking thing. And I think at that point he hadn't ever eaten like more than half of it, and he ate the whole thing. And I was like, how long have you been able to do this? It was so exciting. And which is so much like Kimball, because like with his, like when he took his first steps and when he first stood, it was like we just happened to like try it, like, oh, let's just see if he can take a few steps, and he like just did it. And so I think he's just chill, and he's like, oh, I guess I can do that. Like, sure, if you want me to. And so he was able to take the whole bottle, and within 1 month, he completely weaned off his feeding tube, and he was taking all of his milk by bottle. And that was a huge weight off of our shoulders. Just being able to eliminate a feeding tube and that all of that entails was so big. That relieved so much stress and so much pressure and just a lot of extra work. Like, then we were able to just like take a bottle and feed it to him. That was like the best victory ever. That was so exciting. And so in conclusion, I know I talked a lot about things that were hard, but I'm just so grateful that I survived it, that we survived it, that we are still here to tell the tale, and that things are easier. I'm also so grateful for the miracle that kept him alive, because the eerie and, kind of shaking truth of it is that without a feeding tube and a feeding pump and that technology, Kimball would have starved. And that is very chilling to think about. And it makes, I love his feeding tube. I hate his feeding tube. I love his feeding tube because it kept my son alive. And that is something that is so precious to me. And I'm so grateful to live in this time where he has all the other medical interventions, but specifically the feeding pump and feeding tube, the medicine that is available to him. And I'd also like to end with a shout out to all tubies and tubie parents, and especially to those out there that are in this for life. Props to you. You can follow me on Instagram at the_rare_life. On there, I post updates about episodes that have come out and musings about special needs parenting. If you are interested in supporting this podcast, I invite you to donate on the website, therarelifepodcast.com, or leave a review. That is awesome. Or just tell your friends about it, people who you think could benefit from it. Join us next week to hear my conversation with my awesome cousins, Candace and Sean, as they share all about their son Miller with Angelman syndrome. See you then.